Greetings, friends of liberty. Now most of us, apart from those silly philosophers of the past, like Plato, George Berkeley and Immanuel Kant, unlike those, most of us understand that ideas, in themselves, cannot be immortal. And that is, of course, despite what Plato said, because ideas only exist in the minds of men, and men are not immortal. However, I will allow that it certainly can seem, understood metaphorically, as if some ideas, like the idea of God, can come close to being immortal when we examine their lengthy societal history. How very, very long have men entertained this idea of God or gods? Despite, as we can see all around us, there not being the slightest scintilla of evidence for it. And so then, when we logically must ask, how can this be? Why should men continue to believe in the logically unsustainable, the scientifically unjustifiable, the empirically unverifiable? Is it, perhaps, because men intrinsically are irrational? Or instead, perhaps, at least in part, for other identified, unidentified reasons? And here I would point out that church and state, working together, have supported these ideas with their violence, deceptions, and tax monies collected for millennia. The priests and priestly bureaucracy of Mesopotamia, the sun gods and mothers of ancient Egypt, the so-called quasi-divinities of various Roman emperors, the caliphs and sultans of Islam, stealing the children of Christians to create their slave armies, and to oppress Christian and Jewish populations alike, and finally, the popes and their Christian rulers during our own dark ages, both conspiring with their tax collectors and their inquisitors to kill those who might disagree and who might challenge their intellectual and theological monopoly. What all these examples show is that, far from confirming the intrinsic attractiveness and longevity of the idea of God, they show instead how much violence and how many tax monies have been needed to maintain and prop up the belief. Why should this be if this idea of God is so intrinsically attractive? Now if we turn to the alleged immortality of other long-lasting ideas in your own 20th and 21st centuries in the West today, we find on the docket the work of Kristian Niemietz, economist at the Institute of Economic Affairs, one of the premier British classical liberal think tanks. In Socialism, the failed idea that never dies, Niemietz gives us a penetrating description and analysis of an idea which, despite leading to multiple catastrophic famines and the slaughter of over 100 million human beings, still retains a degree of intellectual credibility among intellectuals and growing popularity among the young today. Niemietz begins specifically by noting the results of a 2016 YouGov survey, that 40% of Britons have a favorable opinion of socialism, with another 40% undecided. Similarly, only 29% of people between the ages of 18 and 50 agreed with the statement, only 29%, competition among private sector companies increases living standards for the great majority of people as it leads to new and better goods and services, creates extra jobs, and keeps down prices. And when it comes to belief in public ownership in 2017, 83% of Britons believed in the NHS, 81% believed in public schools, and 60% in public ownership of railroads. He notes, too, that the politics sections of bookstores are dominated by the books of Naomi Klein, Noam Chomsky, Slavoj Žižek, Yanis Varoufakis, Owen Jones, Hajun Chang, Paul Mason, and Russell Brand. How many countries have actually been socialist? Discounting both the Nordic countries, which score high in levels of economic freedom, even though taxation levels are high, and the social democracies, which are similar, we arrive at the truly socialistic countries, of which over the past 100 years there have been more than 24, among which are the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Albania, Vietnam, Bulgaria, Romania, North Korea, China, East Germany, Cuba, South Yemen, Somalia, Cambodia, Angola, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. All of these attempts have ended in varying degrees of failure. One basic problem with socialist thinking is the denial, as Niemietz shows at length, that A, communistic countries must be authoritarian, socialists thinking somehow they could just as easily have chosen democracy, and secondly, B, socialists imagine in their fantasies that a democratic communism could somehow would have been more economically successful than the authoritarian economic failures they became. You find these forms of denial that communism must be authoritarian expressed by Western socialists again and again. So Owen Jones, for example, saying, Cuba could democratize and grant political freedoms. This is the next stage of the revolution. The only future for socialism is through democracy. But as Niemietz points out, giving workers ownership over the means of production is just an abstract aspiration, not a tangible description of an economic system. How would I be able to meaningfully exercise control over my 60 millionth part of a steel mill or a car factory? And so he points out the obvious fact that socialists deny. Whether socialistic countries become authoritarian is not a matter of choice, it's in their DNA. As Niemietz says, we have still not seen a socialist experiment which has not descended into authoritarianism. The point they miss is that being democratic has always been the aspiration and the promise of socialism. And so when we hear, for example, the quote, power can be directed only through the medium of the working class, obviously it is impossible to do this by coercive methods. Only methods of persuasion can make it possible to unite the working class, to stimulate its independent activity. We shouldn't be surprised to learn from whom this quote came. The murderer of millions, Joseph Stalin. But if we downsize and turn, on the other hand, to examples like the Israeli kibbutz, we find too that a kibbutz cannot be considered an alternative to the market economy. A kibbutz is not an economy in its own right. It is an actor within an economy. A kibbutz with more than 1,000 members would be counted as one of the largest. And of course, just as no socialistic country can ever be democratic, neither can it be free, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, being a typical example. Why did their leaders put up the Berlin Wall? Because otherwise, most everyone would have run off to West Berlin. As Niemietz says, one cannot plan an economy when the factors of production have a will of their own and move around all the time. Turning to psychology, what Niemietz is at great pains to point out here is the psychological three-step involved. First, A, socialists claim that a given country like the Soviet Union fully exemplifies the socialistic ideal. Secondly, B, they start making excuses when the country increasingly fails. And thirdly, C, at the last stage, they then deny that it was ever real socialism. Niemietz calls these phases the honeymoon period, the excuses and whataboutery period, and C, the not real socialism period. Let's examine some personal examples of each. Number one, the honeymoon phase. A, George Bernard Shaw in 1931 on Russian prisons. In England, a delinquent can enter a prison as an ordinary man and come out a criminal type. whereas in Russia, he enters as a criminal type and would come out an ordinary man, but for the difficulty of inducing them to come out at all. As far as I could make out, they could stay as long as they liked in the Gulag. B. Paul Robeson, American singer in 1953 of Stalin. Here was one who was wise and good. The world was fortunate indeed to have his daily guidance. Tens of millions have sung and will sing his praise. Glory to Stalin. C. Carol Tavris, an American social psychologist of Mao's China. It is the certainty of success that dominates the Chinese mood today. Their accomplishments assume dreamlike proportions. They virtually have eliminated many of the social problems that nations are heir to: prostitution, drugs, theft, rape, murder, and litter. D. Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panthers in 1970. Here in Korea, we have found a people who have laid the foundations of communism and who are now rushing to transform their society into an earthly paradise. F. Noam Chomsky in 2009 of Venezuela. What's so exciting about at last visiting Venezuela is that I can see how a better world is being created. Now, number 2, in the excuses and whataboutery phase, we get examples like A. Andrew Murray, Labour Party politician, in 1999. If you believe that the worst crimes visited on humanity this century have been caused by imperialism, then Stalin's birthday might at least be a moment to ponder why the authors of those crimes and their hack propagandists abominate the name of Stalin beyond all others. B. Peter Worsley, British anthropologist, 1974, on Chinese poverty. The Chinese do not wish to create a consumer society. They have not tried to produce cars, televisions, or phones on a mass scale. C. Jean-Paul Sartre in 1973 on Mao's China. A revolutionary regime must get rid of a certain number of individuals that threaten it, and I see no other means for this than death. D. Malcolm Caldwell of the University of London, talking of the Khmer Rouge and their genocide, before they later murdered him when he visited the country. Only the most serious criminals were executed. E. Journalist John Green in 2015, excusing the Berlin Wall. The open border in Berlin was a focus of Cold War tensions. It was also a mecca for spies and for acts of sabotage against the GDR. There is little doubt that the building of the wall in August 1961 contributed to reducing tensions. The GDR did, despite all the warts, represent the germ of a better form of society to that existing in most capitalist countries. Over the years, several people were convicted and imprisoned for political activities, but most of the sentences were for several months or a few years, rarely for very long periods. Finally, number 3, examples of the not real communism phase. A. Venezuelan author Eva Maria on Chavez's Venezuela. Socialism did not cause the crisis, but the opposite. The popular measures enacted during the most prosperous years of the revolution were never socialist, but rather attempts to fix capitalism. B. Journalist Brian Beitler in 2017. The corruption, greed, and elitism is directly at odds with everything socialism represents and everything the people of Venezuela long for. Socialist ideas are not what has led the country to starvation and commodity shortages. C. Noam Chomsky in 2017. I never described Chavez's state capitalist government as socialist or even hinted at such an absurdity. He also said, there hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy. And D. Communist Richard Wolff, who for some reason comes up often on my YouTube feed. The struggle between communism and capitalism never happened. The Soviets didn't establish communism. So having seen now examples of the three essential stages of self-deception regarding socialist beliefs, praise, rationalization, and denial, let's turn to our author's two basic explanations for why these ideas endure. Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionist model and Bryan Caplan's theory of rational irrationality. Number one, Jonathan Haidt and his social intuitionism. Niemietz believes that social psychologist Haidt is accurate when he argues that human beings are very often fundamentally irrational, in not using reason to come to conclusions, but instead using reason to justify the intuitions and emotional conclusions they've already formed. Haidt sums this up in the formula intuitions come first, strategic reason comes second. Thus, our mind does not work like a judge, but it works more like a lawyer who settles for the broad position they want to take in court early on. Number two, Bryan Caplan and his rational irrationality. As Niemietz explains, holding on to a demonstrably wrong belief can be entirely rational if that belief is a source of pleasure, pride, emotional comfort, and perhaps even a sense of identity. Beliefs that are emotionally appealing confer a benefit on the person holding them, irrespective of whether or not they're true. In other words, if a false belief like socialism is emotionally satisfying, and if there is no cost associated with holding it, we would expect it to be widely held. And so Niemietz points out that if anti-capitalism is mainly visceral, and anti-capitalist arguments mainly post hoc attempts to rationalize that visceral dislike of capitalism, we would expect anti-capitalists to quickly replace one line of attack with another if it is convenient to do so. This has indeed happened many times. And with regard to the cost to someone like well-known socialist provocateur Owen Jones, imagine if a public figure such as Owen Jones wrote, "Let's be honest with ourselves. Yes, it was socialism that ruined Venezuela." They would be called sellouts and traitors. For them, the cost of giving up on a wrong idea would be infinitely greater than for the average Joe. Finally, there still remains the fundamental question implied by the book's title. Why does there seem to be a preference for socialism? In other words, why do we so easily dismiss all the massive gains that capitalism delivers and obsess over its shortcomings? And his answer is evolutionary tribalism. He says, our minds are in many ways poorly adapted to a modern environment. They are adapted to the economic life of a tribal society, not to an economy based on the division of labor and coordinated by anonymous mechanisms. We all know that a modern economy is infinitely more complex than a mammoth hunt. But in essence, that is what socialism is. It is an attempt to turn economic life once again into a consciously directed group effort. So he's saying it's in our genes and our alleged instinctual tribal emotional responses. Is he right? Let's turn now to evaluating the book overall and these arguments in detail. First, his extensive descriptions of socialist psychology are superb and in fact completely corroborate what on this channel, as longtime subscribers will know, I've tried to create, which is a whole theory of ideology formation founded on the ideas of self-deception of the philosopher Herbert Fingarette, whose classic book on the topic, Self-Deception, I reviewed here back in February 2024. The descriptive part of Niemietz's book over and over again illustrates the self-deception that believers in socialism constantly engage in, first in uncritically accepting it, and then their various forms of excuse-making, and finally denial. But what are we to make of Niemietz's explanations, and not just his descriptions of self-deceptive socialists? The fundamental problem facing him is that he doesn't recognize the enormous role that societal coercion, as I said in the very beginning, plays in creating these very ideologies, belief systems, and attitudes, a factor that's exceedingly obvious once you recognize it. So as I pointed out, again, to start this video on the religious side, if we look at the historical formation, say, of Catholic and Islamic beliefs, we see, for century after century, the use of state violence and coercion. to kill or harm those who disagree, to invade and convert the people of other countries, and to use the coercive taxing power of the state to maintain and enforce a religious ideology and conformity. Similarly, on the secular side, if we were to look at modern mainland China and ask why so many of their citizens are nationalistic, might it perhaps have something to do with the fact that public Chinese schools, broadcasting, and CCP propaganda constantly indoctrinate the citizens with a alleged superiority of mainland China over everyone else? And similarly, if we look historically at Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, they do not use coercive state institutions. Do they not use coercive state institutions like schools, public broadcasting, the control of media, and threats of violence to similarly promote intellectual conformity? When it comes to the modern West, we find exactly those state-supported institutions of both public and private colleges, state broadcasting like the BBC and NPR, and the government with its anti-discrimination and affirmative action statutes and mandates that, especially since World War II, promote, indoctrinate, and enforce all the many ideas on the left, and it's often anti-capitalism. No surprise there, if Niemietz would just open his eyes and see it. Turning to Jonathan Haidt, there are three basic problems. Number one, first, we all go through life and we don't necessarily articulate why we do everything. But this doesn't mean that when we attempt to explain the reasons for our actions, they are all post hoc rationalizations. Number two, Haidt ignores the whole socialization process in creating in children the very intuitions and feelings that he claims are attributable to human nature and genes. So, for example, if Muslims act like and thus teach their children that eating pork is wrong and their kids develop an aversion to eating pork, then that feeling is created by the religious belief system, which itself, as I just described, has been created by a millennia-plus long process of societal and institutional coercion. And number three, this means in the end that Haidt's theories are descriptive, explaining nothing about human nature. And Bryan Caplan, the same basic problem applies. It's only rational to be irrational if your society supports and facilitates that irrationality. Yes, in Nazi Germany, but in modern America, it depends what it is, but certainly not as much. In a free society, you are much more likely to have your self-deception unveiled, and you won't be able to enjoy your irrational feelings and beliefs as much, because they will come with increased social and personal costs. So Caplan, too, is ignoring the very use of societal coercion that Niemietz and Haidt are also ignoring, that create the tribalness and intuitions and irrationality in the first place. Finally, we turn to Niemietz's ultimate explanation, his claim that human beings are naturally tribal. Again, this is an assumption, and so it fails because it doesn't remove the effects of societal coercion on creating and facilitating the use of tribal ideologies, both religious and secular. In addition, when we see how much human beings like shopping and trading and doing the things they do in capitalistic societies, it's not at all clear that his claim that people intrinsically like socialism more than capitalism is also anything more than an assumption. Ready for my part now to soon head out into London and to the Albion Tavern with its many choices of succulent mutton, sirloin, and roast duck and pheasant, complemented with an array of delicious soups and sauces, I and many others relishing the purchasing power of our pounds, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.